The Dark Mind Games of Power. What Machiavelli and Robert Greene don't want you to know. Imagine walking into a room and instantly knowing who holds the real power. Not the person with the fancy title or the loudest voice, but the true puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes. What if I told you there are people who can read your thoughts, predict your next move, and influence your decisions without you ever noticing? These aren't comic book supervillains or fictional characters. They're real people walking among us, using psychological tactics that have been refined over centuries. Hey, before we dive deeper, I need to give you a quick warning. What we're about to discuss isn't your typical self-help advice. This is the raw, uncensored truth about how power really works. Some people might find this uncomfortable. If you prefer keeping your illusions about how the world operates, maybe skip this one. Still here? Good. Let's pull back the curtain on the psychological warfare that's happening all around you every single day. About 500 years ago, a man named Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a little book called The Prince. After being tortured, exiled, and watching the brutal power games of Renaissance Italy. Many people misunderstand Machiavelli, thinking he was advocating for cruelty. What he was actually doing was observing and documenting the raw truth about power, how it's gained, how it's kept, and how it's lost. He wasn't creating these tactics, he was simply the first to have the courage to write them down. Fast forward to our time, and Robert Greene took these same ideas and turned them into his controversial bestseller, The 48 Laws of Power. Greene spent years studying history's most powerful figures, from Sun Tzu to Catherine the Great, from Talleyrand to modern business titans. What he discovered was astonishing. The same psychological principles that determined who ruled 5 centuries ago are still deciding who gets ahead today, in offices, politics, and even in your personal relationships. What's fascinating isn't how much has changed since Machiavelli's time, but how little. Human psychology remains remarkably consistent. We like to think we're rational beings making logical decisions, but the truth is far more complicated. Most of our choices are driven by unconscious biases, emotional triggers, and psychological patterns we're not even aware of. The masters of power understand these hidden mechanisms and use them to their advantage. These power moves aren't taught in school. You won't find them in leadership seminars or corporate training programs. The people who master them never talk about them openly. That's exactly why they seem so naturally powerful. They're playing a game you don't even know exists. And that's what makes this knowledge so valuable. Once you can see the game being played around you, you can never be blindly manipulated again. Let's talk about one of the most powerful tactics: hiding your true intentions. Think about it. When someone doesn't know why you're doing something, their mind starts creating explanations. They project their own fears and hopes onto your actions. As Machiavelli figured out centuries ago, people fear what they can't predict. The moment people understand your real motives, they gain power over you. They can anticipate your next move, counter your strategy, or use your desires against you. I saw this play out in a tech company I worked with. The CEO never revealed his complete strategy to anyone. He would share different pieces with different executives, keeping everyone focused on their specific area. No one had the complete picture except him. When competitors tried to predict his next move, they were always one step behind because they were reacting to individual actions rather than understanding the master plan. Within 3 years, this company went from an industry afterthought to a dominant player, largely because no one could anticipate their strategy or counter it effectively. Look at how Steve Jobs operated when he returned to Apple. He didn't announce his full master plan. He made moves that seemed disconnected, cutting product lines, bringing back certain people, forming unexpected partnerships. Everyone saw the individual actions, but nobody saw the complete chess game until it was too late. By the time his competitors understood what he was really doing, he had already transformed Apple and revolutionized multiple industries. Here's a little insider tip. Never explain yourself completely. Always leave room for people to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. When someone asks why you're doing something, give answers that sound transparent but actually reveal nothing about your real goals. This creates the impression of openness while protecting your strategic advantage. You might say, "I'm exploring several possibilities," or "I want to see where this leads us." Responses that seem forthcoming but actually reveal nothing of substance. But hiding your intentions is just the beginning. Another powerful tactic is being strategically unpredictable. Our brains are constantly looking for patterns. It's how we make sense of the world. When someone's behavior doesn't follow a predictable pattern, it creates anxiety. Your mind gets stuck trying to figure them out, which drains your mental energy and puts you at a disadvantage. I remember consulting for a negotiation where one side would randomly change their communication style. Sometimes they'd be collaborative and friendly, other times stern and unyielding. There was no apparent reason for these shifts, which kept the other party constantly off balance. The unpredictable team ended up getting most of what they wanted, not because their position was stronger, but because they created psychological discomfort that the other side wanted to escape by making concessions. Look at someone like Vladimir Putin on the world stage. Love him or hate him, you can't deny he's mastered strategic unpredictability. Foreign policy experts and world leaders constantly struggle to anticipate what he'll do next. This unpredictability has given Russia more influence than its economic or military power would otherwise command. When no one can predict your next move, they're forced to react to you instead of acting on their own terms. The trick here is to be generally consistent in most things, then selectively unpredictable in important moments. The contrast between your usual reliability and these unexpected shifts creates maximum psychological impact. It leaves people disoriented exactly when they need clarity most. Think about applying this in a negotiation or when you're seeking a promotion. Being predictable in 90% of your interactions, then completely changing your approach during crucial conversations can be incredibly effective. Have you ever noticed how the things that are hardest to get are the things you want most? That's not a coincidence. It's a fundamental glitch in human psychology that powerful people exploit constantly. Machiavelli observed that rulers who made themselves too available lost their mystique and power. Today, we call this the scarcity effect. Your brain automatically assigns higher value to things that seem rare or exclusive. I watched this dynamic play out with two equally talented consultants at a firm I worked with. One was always available, answering emails at all hours, accepting every meeting request, and sharing all his knowledge freely. The other was selective with her time, measured in her communication, and deliberate about which projects she accepted. Though their actual expertise was comparable, the second consultant was perceived as far more valuable, commanded higher fees, and was sought after by the most prestigious clients. The difference wasn't ability, it was perceived scarcity. Think about it in your own life. The colleague who's always available, always eager to help, always sharing everything they know. Do people value their input? Usually not. Now think about that person who's selective with their time, measured with their words, and careful about which projects they take on. Even if their actual abilities are the same, they're perceived as more valuable. Warren Buffett understands this perfectly. In an age where most executives are constantly communicating through multiple channels, Buffett's annual shareholder letters are relatively brief and infrequent. When he does speak publicly, markets move because his words are rare. He's created scarcity around his insights, transforming them from mere opinions into valuable events. The key is to create information asymmetry, know everything about others while revealing little about yourself. Make your most valuable assets, your time, attention, and approval, things that others must earn rather than receive freely. Remember, people don't value what comes easily. This isn't about being arrogant or inaccessible. It's about understanding that when something requires effort to obtain, people automatically assign it greater value. Now, here's where things get really interesting. One of the most powerful weapons in the psychological arsenal isn't intimidation or aggression, it's tactical empathy. Understanding other people's deepest desires and fears gives you an incredible advantage. While Machiavelli advised princes to appear merciful while being calculating, today's masters of power take this to another level. We humans have an overwhelming need to feel understood. When someone seems to genuinely get us, especially our unspoken desires and fears, our psychological defenses naturally come down. We start trusting them, revealing more, becoming more vulnerable. What looks like compassion from the outside is actually reconnaissance. I witnessed a master of this technique turn around a hostile business acquisition. The acquiring company's representatives spent the first meetings doing nothing but asking questions and listening. He didn't push his agenda or make demands. He simply demonstrated deep understanding of the target company's concerns, reflecting back their fears and hopes with remarkable accuracy. By the third meeting, executives who had been ready to fight the takeover were voluntarily sharing sensitive information and asking for advice. They trusted someone who had done nothing to earn that trust except to demonstrate understanding. The acquisition proceeded smoothly, with terms heavily favoring the buyer. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a master at this. He made everyone feel personally understood and valued. Behind this seemingly genuine empathy was a calculating mind that noted weaknesses, pressure points, and hidden motivations. This allowed him to manage an unprecedented coalition of competing interests during World War II, playing allies and enemies against each other while maintaining their loyalty. If you want to try this yourself, start using what negotiation experts call calibrated questions. Open-ended questions that seem innocent but are designed to reveal psychological vulnerabilities. Questions like, what would need to happen for this to work for you? Or what concerns you most about this situation? These sound supportive but actually extract valuable information about what's driving someone and what they're afraid of. The more you know about someone's inner landscape, the more effectively you can navigate their psychology. Here's something else powerful people understand. You become who you hang around. Machiavelli advised princes to carefully choose advisors because their reputation would reflect on them. Your brain uses mental shortcuts to make judgments, and one of the strongest is the association principle. We automatically transfer qualities from one person to another based solely on their connection. The crazy thing is, this happens unconsciously, making it almost impossible to defend against. In today's world, this means being extremely careful about who you're seen with, which projects your name is attached to, and which groups you join. Each association becomes a subtle psychological statement about your value and position. I've seen careers made or destroyed based solely on association. One talented executive I worked with saw his prospects tank after being associated with a failed project, even though the failure wasn't his fault. Another mediocre performer rose rapidly through an organization simply because she was frequently seen with the company's most successful leaders. Look at how Jeff Bezos strategically associated Amazon with established brands during its early years before it had built its own credibility. By forming partnerships with trusted institutions like the Washington Post and Barnes & Noble, he borrowed their established credibility through mere association. When Amazon was just starting, most people were nervous about entering credit card information online. By associating with trusted brands, Amazon inherited their trustworthiness without having to build it from scratch. Intelligence agencies call this legend building. strategically creating associations that craft a specific perception of you. The masters arrange opportunities to be seen with high-status individuals while maintaining plausible reasons for these connections that don't reveal their strategic intent. You can do this by joining certain organizations, volunteering for high-visibility projects, or even being selective about which social media posts you engage with. Each association shapes how others perceive you. Now I'm going to share something that might blow your mind a little. Have you ever noticed how people will change their beliefs before they'll admit inconsistency in their actions? This is called cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the most powerful psychological levers available. Machiavelli observed how people would rationalize their rulers' actions rather than question their loyalty. Today, we understand the science behind this. When someone's actions contradict their beliefs, it creates psychological discomfort. The mind automatically works to resolve this discomfort, usually by changing beliefs rather than questioning behaviors. I saw this principle used masterfully when a company needed to implement a controversial policy. Instead of announcing the complete policy at once, which would have faced strong resistance, leadership asked employees to implement small parts of it gradually. Each small action created internal pressure to justify why they were complying. By the time the full policy was revealed, most employees had already adjusted their beliefs to support it, even though they would have strongly opposed it initially. Casino design is built entirely around this principle. Patrons who consider themselves rational continue gambling despite mounting losses. Rather than questioning their behavior, continuing to gamble, they develop elaborate beliefs about being due for a win or having special systems, changing their beliefs rather than their actions. So how can you use this? When facing resistance, don't argue directly against someone's beliefs. Instead, get them to take small actions that contradict those beliefs. Each action creates internal pressure to resolve the contradiction. This pressure builds until their beliefs shift to align with their behavior, making them think the change was their own idea. This is far more effective than direct persuasion because people rarely resist their own conclusions. Let me share one more powerful tactic that might surprise you: strategic vulnerability. Machiavelli advised princes to appear virtuous while being calculating. Today's psychological research confirms what he intuited. Perfection creates distance and suspicion. When someone competent reveals a minor flaw, they actually become more likable and trustworthy. Psychologists call this the pratfall effect. I watched a senior executive use this technique during a company crisis. Rather than presenting an image of flawless confidence, he acknowledged specific concerns, admitted past misjudgments, and shared his personal struggles with the situation. The room, which had been hostile, completely shifted. By the end of his presentation, the same people who had been planning to challenge him were offering support and solutions. His calculated vulnerability disarmed their criticism more effectively than any defense or justification could have. Look at Mark Zuckerberg's meticulously crafted casual image, from his hoodie to his seemingly unpolished public speaking style. These aren't accidents, they're carefully orchestrated imperfections designed to make him seem more authentic and approachable while directing attention away from Facebook's sophisticated data operations. Intelligence operatives call this a sacrifice play, a pre-planned disclosure of something that appears significant but actually conceals deeper truths. You share something that seems vulnerable or revealing, creating the illusion of complete transparency while protecting your actual strategic advantages. The key is selecting vulnerabilities that seem meaningful but don't compromise your real position. What makes all these approaches so effective is that they operate beneath conscious awareness. The crude manipulators you can easily spot are amateurs. The true masters create situations where people believe they're acting freely while being subtly guided. The real power comes from layering these tactics in sophisticated combinations. Hiding intentions creates mystery, which enhances scarcity, which increases the impact of tactical empathy, and so on. You might be wondering, why doesn't everyone use these tactics if they're so effective? The truth is, most people can't overcome their own psychological limitations. They fear social rejection if their tactics are discovered. They've internalized moral frameworks that create hesitation. They react emotionally instead of maintaining strategic patience. Or they apply these principles inconsistently, undermining their effectiveness. I've watched countless people try to implement these strategies and fail because they couldn't separate their emotions from their actions. They get angry and reveal their true intentions. They feel guilty and compensate by over-explaining. They get impatient and abandon their strategy before it bears fruit. The rare individuals who master these principles separate their strategic thinking from their emotional responses. They maintain enough psychological distance to implement these tactics dispassionately while appearing completely authentic. I know what some of you are thinking. Isn't all this unethical? It's a fair question, but the answer isn't as simple as most people think. Power itself is neutral, neither good nor evil. These psychological principles simply describe how human cognition actually works, not how we pretend it works. Those who refuse to understand these dynamics don't take the moral high ground. They just ensure their subordination to those who do understand. Think of it like martial arts. Learning how to fight doesn't mean you'll become violent. In fact, those with the most training are usually the least likely to start conflicts because they understand the consequences. Similarly, understanding psychological influence doesn't make you manipulative. It gives you the awareness to use these principles ethically and to recognize when they're being used against you. The most ethical approach is to master these principles while establishing personal boundaries for how you'll use them. Understanding manipulation is your best defense against being manipulated. Knowing how to influence doesn't mean you have to use that knowledge exploitatively. You can use these same principles to become a more effective leader, to help people overcome limiting beliefs, or to create positive change in organizations. Here's the really interesting part. The true masters of psychological influence are rarely recognized as manipulators. Their impact feels natural, their timing seems fortunate, and their success appears deserved. This invisibility is the hallmark of true mastery, the ability to shape reality while seeming to simply navigate it. As Machiavelli observed 5 centuries ago, everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. These tactics have shaped world events for centuries and continue to determine who rises to power in every area of human activity. Understanding them gives you a tremendous advantage in navigating complex situations involving other people. From negotiating a raise to managing difficult relationships, these principles apply universally because they're based on how the human mind actually works, not how we wish it worked. But this knowledge comes with responsibility. Those who study these principles purely for exploitation eventually self-destruct through overreach or create enemies who unite against them. Those who master these dynamics while maintaining ethical boundaries gain sustainable influence that grows over time. The choice of how to apply this knowledge is yours, but understand that these principles themselves are simply tools. Their morality depends entirely on how they're used. Whether you use these insights or ignore them, they will continue to shape the world around you. The truly dangerous people aren't those who appear threatening. They're those who've mastered the invisible art of psychological influence, hiding their power behind masks of virtue, authenticity, and benevolence. Now you know their secrets. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you use it to protect yourself from manipulation, to become more effective in your career, to create positive change? Or will you pretend these dynamics don't exist and remain vulnerable to those who understand them better than you do? If you found this valuable, hit that subscribe button because in my next video, I'll be taking these principles even deeper, showing you exactly how to apply them in specific situations that matter to you. I'll reveal the psychological triggers that make people immediately trust you, the subtle body language signals that communicate power without saying a word, and the verbal patterns that bypass rational resistance and speak directly to the unconscious mind. And trust me, once you start seeing these dynamics at play in your everyday life, you'll never look at human interaction the same way again. Remember, I'm sharing this information for educational purposes only. Understanding these psychological principles is essential for protecting yourself against manipulation and for ethical leadership. Use this knowledge responsibly. Mind control secrets. How powerful people hack your brain. Machiavelli and Kahneman revealed. Have you ever made a decision you later couldn't explain? Maybe you bought something you didn't need, trusted someone against your better judgment, or made a choice that seemed right in the moment but left you wondering why afterward. If so, I've got news for you. Your mind was probably hacked. And the most disturbing part? It happens to all of us, every single day. Welcome back, everyone. If you saw my previous video about Machiavelli and Robert Greene, you know we've just started scratching the surface of how power really works. Today we're going even deeper, and I have to warn you, once you see how your mind can be manipulated, you'll never look at your decisions the same way again. Let me ask you something. Do you think you're in control of your own thoughts? That your decisions are logical and rational? I hate to break it to you, but modern science has proven something Machiavelli understood 500 years ago. Most of your decisions happen automatically, without you even realizing it. And the people who understand this fact have an incredible advantage over everyone else. 5 centuries ago, Machiavelli observed how easily rulers could manipulate public opinion by understanding certain patterns in human thinking. He had no scientific terms for these patterns, but he described them perfectly. Fast forward to today, and Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman has mapped out exactly how these mental shortcuts work in his groundbreaking book, Thinking Fast and Slow. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how accurately Machiavelli described these psychological mechanisms centuries before they were scientifically proven. He didn't have the data or the research, but he had something equally powerful: razor-sharp observation of human behavior across history. Kahneman's major discovery was that our minds operate in 2 distinct systems. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. It makes thousands of decisions without our conscious awareness. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and logical. It requires effort and energy. Here's the key insight. We think System 2 is in charge most of the time, but it's actually System 1 running the show. We're making unconscious decisions constantly, then using our rational mind to justify them after the fact. This insight perfectly aligns with Machiavelli's observations about how rulers maintain power. He understood that if you want to control people, you don't appeal to their logic. You tap into their automatic, intuitive reactions. The most powerful people in history have always known this instinctively. Now science has proven they were right all along. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. A few years ago, I was consulting for a company undergoing a major reorganization. The CEO needed to implement some controversial changes that would face serious resistance. Instead of presenting a detailed rational case to the employees, System 2, he did something fascinating. He planted seeds of fear about the company's future in small, seemingly casual comments over several weeks. He strategically shared worst-case scenarios about competitors and market threats in informal settings. By the time he formally announced the reorganization, the employees' System 1 thinking had already been primed to accept any solution that would address these threats. Their automatic fear response had been activated long before their rational minds had a chance to analyze the actual changes. The resistance the company expected never materialized. The employees actually thanked leadership for taking action against threats that had been carefully planted in their minds. This is exactly the kind of psychological maneuver Machiavelli described when he wrote, "Men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived." He wasn't being cynical. He was observing how mental shortcuts make us vulnerable to manipulation. Let's talk about one of the most powerful cognitive biases that Machiavelli exploited centuries before. Kahneman gave it a name: confirmation bias. This is our natural tendency to notice and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while ignoring or forgetting evidence that contradicts our existing views. Machiavelli wrote that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. In modern terms, he was saying that people form quick impressions based on limited information, then selectively notice details that confirm these initial judgments. Skilled manipulators use this bias masterfully. They study your existing beliefs and then feed you information that aligns with them. Once they've established themselves as a source that thinks like you do on certain topics, they can gradually introduce new ideas that you'll accept with far less scrutiny. Why? Because your System 1 has already categorized them as trustworthy or like-minded. I've watched politicians use this technique with surgical precision. They begin by strongly emphasizing values they share with their target audience, perhaps traditional family values or environmental concerns. Once they've established this connection, they can introduce policies that have nothing to do with these values, but their audience will support them anyway. The confirmation bias creates a halo effect that extends to everything they say or do. Machiavelli advised princes to exploit this tendency by carefully controlling public perception of their first actions in power. He knew that first impressions would create a lens through which all future actions would be interpreted. As he wrote, "Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you seem to be. Few know what you really are." Here's a dark psychology tip that power players use. If you want someone to trust you completely, start by expressing opinions they already hold, especially on emotional topics. Their System 1 will categorize you as one of us long before their System 2 has a chance to analyze whether you're trustworthy. Once established, this trust is remarkably resilient, persisting even in the face of contradictory evidence. Another powerful cognitive bias Machiavelli understood is framing. How the way information is presented dramatically changes how we respond to it. Kahneman's research showed that identical situations presented in different frames lead to completely different decisions. For example, people are more likely to choose a medical treatment described as having an 80% survival rate than one with a 20% mortality rate, even though they're mathematically identical. Machiavelli was a master of framing. He advised rulers to frame necessary cruelty as protection for the greater good. He suggested timing unpopular actions to coincide with events that could be blamed for negative outcomes. He understood that it wasn't the reality that mattered most, but how that reality was framed for the audience. I've seen executives use framing to completely transform resistant organizations. One particularly skilled CEO never announced cost-cutting measures. Instead, he introduced investment reallocation for future growth. He didn't implement layoffs, he created organizational renewal opportunities. These weren't just euphemisms, they were strategic frames that activated completely different mental and emotional responses. When people heard cost-cutting, their System 1 thinking immediately created images of loss, hardship, and unfairness. When they heard investment reallocation, it triggered associations with progress, strategy, and opportunity. The actual changes were identical, but the psychological response was completely different. Machiavelli advised princes to always frame their actions in terms of necessity rather than choice. As he wrote, "Men will not look at things as they really are, but as they wish them to be, and are ruined." When people believe you have no choice but to take certain actions, they're far less likely to blame you for negative consequences. Now let's talk about a cognitive bias so powerful that Machiavelli built many of his strategies around it, even though it wouldn't be named until centuries later: the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is our tendency to be overconfident in areas where we have limited knowledge, coupled with an inability to recognize our own incompetence. Machiavelli observed that people with little understanding of politics or governance were often the most confident in their opinions. He advised rulers to use this overconfidence against their rivals, encouraging them to take actions beyond their true capabilities. As he wrote, "The promise given was a necessity of the past. The broken promise is a necessity of the present." I witnessed a fascinating example of this in action during a corporate power struggle. A senior executive identified a rival who consistently overestimated his strategic abilities. Instead of directly challenging this rival, the executive praised his strategic thinking publicly and encouraged him to take on a highly visible initiative that was likely to fail. The rival's overconfidence led him to accept enthusiastically, and when the inevitable failure occurred, he had unknowingly engineered his own downfall. The truly sophisticated application of the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just about exploiting others' overconfidence. It's about strategically displaying a lack of expertise in areas where you actually have mastery. Machiavelli advised princes to occasionally appear less knowledgeable than they actually were, creating opportunities for rivals to overextend themselves based on false confidence. Modern power players use this technique by asking seemingly naive questions that lead others to expose their thinking, or by appearing less prepared than they actually are. When others believe you know less than you do, they reveal more information, speak more freely, and often make critical errors in judgment. One of the most insidious cognitive biases Machiavelli exploited was the availability heuristic, our tendency to overestimate the likelihood and importance of things that come readily to mind. Kahneman's research showed that vivid emotional examples have a much greater impact on our thinking than statistics or abstract facts, even when the latter are more relevant. Machiavelli advised rulers to create memorable examples of consequences for disloyalty. He wasn't necessarily advocating for cruelty. He was leveraging the availability heuristic. When people can easily recall a vivid example of punishment, they overestimate the risk of similar consequences for themselves. I've seen this principle applied in modern leadership, though obviously in less extreme ways. One CEO I worked with made a practice of publicly celebrating successes and privately addressing failures. Over time, his team developed an exaggerated perception of how often success occurred, creating a culture of positive expectation that actually improved performance. The availability bias is also why skilled manipulators often use vivid stories rather than data to make their points. Your System 1 thinking is powerfully influenced by narrative and imagery in ways that bypass your rational analysis. A single emotional story about an immigrant committing a crime will influence many people's views on immigration policy more than comprehensive statistics showing the opposite trend. Machiavelli understood that memorable examples shape perception more powerfully than reality. As he wrote, "Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions." Let's talk about another cognitive bias that gives tremendous power to those who understand it: the anchoring effect. This is our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions. Kahneman's research showed that even random numbers can unconsciously influence estimates on completely unrelated questions. Machiavelli advised rulers to strategically control the initial information their subjects received about any significant event. He understood that this first impression would anchor all subsequent interpretations. As he wrote, "The first impression that one gets of a ruler and of his brains is from seeing the men that he has around him." I've seen anchoring used masterfully in negotiations. One particularly skilled negotiator always started with an extreme position that he knew was unreasonable. He wasn't expecting this position to be accepted. He was setting an anchor that would make his actual target seem reasonable by comparison. I watched him secure deals that were objectively unfavorable to the other party, who nonetheless felt satisfied, because the final terms were so much better than the initial anchor. You can see anchoring used in pricing strategies everywhere. When a store shows an original price with a discount, that original price is an anchor that makes the sale price seem more attractive, even if the discounted price is actually the standard market rate. The power of the initial number is so strong that it distorts our ability to evaluate the actual value. Machiavelli would recognize these techniques immediately. He advised princes to occasionally make requests or demands they knew would be refused, only to follow with their actual desires, which would then seem reasonable by comparison. The most sophisticated application of anchoring isn't about obvious extremes, though. It's about subtly establishing reference points that frame all subsequent discussions. When someone begins a performance review by discussing your areas for growth before your achievements, they're setting an anchor that will color the entire conversation. When a leader opens a strategic discussion by emphasizing threats rather than opportunities, they're anchoring the group's thinking in a specific direction. Now let's discuss a cognitive bias that Machiavelli exploited with particular skill: the halo effect. This is our tendency to let our overall impression of a person influence how we feel about their specific traits or actions. If we like someone generally, we're predisposed to view all their behaviors positively, and vice versa. Machiavelli advised rulers to carefully cultivate a general reputation for certain positive qualities, knowing this would create a halo effect that would extend to their other actions. As he wrote, "It is not essential that a prince should have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very essential that he should appear to have them." I watched a corporate leader use this principle masterfully. She deliberately established a reputation for absolute integrity in financial matters. She was transparent, precise, and impeccably honest about numbers and budgets. This created a powerful halo effect that extended to areas where she was actually far less straightforward, like organizational politics and personnel decisions. Because people trusted her completely on financial matters, they assumed she was equally trustworthy in all other areas. The halo effect explains why celebrities can effectively endorse products they have no expertise about, why attractive people are assumed to be more competent, and why a single positive quality can shield someone from criticism in unrelated areas. Machiavelli understood that carefully cultivating the right reputation in a few key areas would create a protective halo that would extend across all activities. So how can you protect yourself from people who understand and exploit these cognitive biases? First, recognize that your intuitive reactions, your System 1 thinking, are constantly being triggered and manipulated. When you feel a strong immediate response to something, that's exactly when you need to pause and engage your System 2 thinking. Ask yourself, why am I reacting this way? What specific information triggered this response? What frames or anchors might be influencing me? What information am I not seeing or considering? Simply being aware of these biases doesn't make you immune to them, but conscious awareness is the essential first step. Second, deliberately seek out contradictory information and opposing viewpoints. Our confirmation bias means we naturally avoid information that challenges our existing beliefs. But this is exactly what we need to make better decisions. Make it a practice to ask, what would someone who disagrees with me say about this? What evidence would they point to? Third, slow down your decision-making when something important is at stake. System 1 thinking happens automatically and instantly, while System 2 requires time and mental energy. Many manipulators create artificial time pressure specifically to keep you in System 1 mode. When someone is pushing you to decide quickly, that's often a red flag that they don't want your rational mind involved. Fourth, beware of emotional appeals and vivid examples. These are designed to trigger your availability bias and override systematic thinking. When someone uses a powerful story or emotional example, consciously remind yourself that a single case may not represent the overall reality. Ask for data and broader evidence. Finally, develop mental habits that engage your System 2 thinking. Deliberately question your initial assumptions. Look for evidence that contradicts your first impressions. Consider multiple interpretations of events rather than accepting the first explanation that comes to mind. These habits won't make you immune to cognitive biases, but they'll make you a much harder target for those who seek to exploit them. Remember what Machiavelli wrote: "The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar." By understanding how these cognitive biases work, you remove yourself from that vulgar crowd and become much more difficult to manipulate. It's worth noting that these same principles can be used constructively as well as manipulatively. Good leaders use framing to help teams see opportunities rather than just obstacles. Effective teachers use the availability heuristic to make important concepts memorable. Skilled communicators use anchoring to establish productive starting points for difficult conversations. The cognitive biases themselves are neutral. They're simply how our minds work. The ethical question lies in how this knowledge is applied. Understanding these mechanisms gives you power. The power to influence others, certainly, but also the power to protect yourself from unwanted influence. What's truly remarkable is how accurately Machiavelli described these psychological processes centuries before modern research confirmed them. He didn't have the benefit of brain scans or controlled experiments, but his careful observation of human behavior across history revealed the same patterns that scientists have now verified. This convergence between Renaissance political theory and cutting-edge psychological research tells us something important. Human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed. The same cognitive patterns that shaped politics in Machiavelli's time continue to determine who gains and holds power today. The only difference is that now we have scientific terminology to describe what Machiavelli observed through raw experience. I hope this exploration of cognitive biases has opened your eyes to how your mind actually works. Not how you wish it worked or how you think it works. Understanding these mechanisms isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about becoming less manipulable. It's about recognizing when these natural tendencies are being exploited and having the mental tools to make more conscious choices. If you've found this valuable, make sure to hit subscribe, because in the next video, we'll explore how Machiavelli's insights intersect with Robert Cialdini's principles of influence, the specific triggers that can bypass rational thought and create automatic compliance. You'll learn exactly how these principles are being used to shape your behavior every day, often without your awareness. Let me know in the comments if you've recognized any of these cognitive biases being used on you, or if you've used them yourself. And remember, this knowledge comes with responsibility. Understanding the architecture of influence gives you power, but true wisdom lies in how you choose to use it. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you recognize manipulation tactics and make more conscious decisions, not to encourage unethical behavior. 7. Persuasion Secrets: How the Powerful Get What They Want. Machiavelli's Hidden Playbook. Have you ever wondered why some people can walk into a room and instantly get others to do what they want? Or why certain leaders throughout history could get entire nations to follow them, even when it wasn't in their best interest? What if I told you it's not about being the smartest or the richest? It's about knowing certain psychological triggers that are basically wired into all of our brains. This isn't some made-up theory. It's the real science behind persuasion, and the world's most influential people have been using these same techniques for hundreds of years. Hey guys, welcome back. If you caught my previous videos, you know we've been diving into how Machiavelli figured out the mind games of power way back in the 1500s. Today we're taking things up a notch. I'm going to show you the exact psychological buttons that powerful people push to get others to do what they want, and how you can spot these techniques being used on you. Quick heads up before we start. Once you see these persuasion tactics, you'll start noticing them everywhere. Your favorite brands use them. Politicians use them. Your boss probably uses them. Even your friends and family might be using them on you. Some people prefer not knowing when they're being influenced, so if that's you, maybe sit this one out. Still here? Perfect. Let's get into it. So back in the 1500s, this guy Machiavelli writes The Prince, basically a how-to manual for rulers. A lot of people think he was just telling leaders to be cruel, but that's not really it. He was actually breaking down the psychological tricks that work to lead people and keep them loyal. Now fast forward about 500 years to the 1980s. A researcher named Robert Cialdini spends years studying what makes people say yes to things. He discovers that there are basically 6 main triggers that work on pretty much everyone, regardless of culture or background. He puts all this in his book, Influence. Here's what blew my mind when I first discovered this. Almost everything Machiavelli told rulers to do matches exactly with what Cialdini proved through scientific research centuries later. Somehow, just by watching people, Machiavelli figured out the same persuasion tricks that modern science took hundreds of years to confirm. It's like he had a special ability to see how people's minds really work. Let me start with what might be the most powerful persuasion trick ever. The rule of give and take, or what Cialdini calls reciprocity. It's pretty simple. When someone does something for us, we feel like we need to do something back for them. It's almost like we can't help it. And often we end up giving back way more than we got in the first place. Machiavelli totally got this. He told rulers to strategically give gifts and favors because he knew each gift created an invisible debt. He said, "Men are quicker to forget the death of their father than the loss of their inheritance." Pretty harsh, but he was making a real point. Actual benefits create loyalty better than just abstract ideas or promises. I remember watching a CEO who was amazing at using this. He'd do these small personal gestures for key employees. He'd remember their kids' names, send personal notes when they were going through tough times, or bend company rules when they had a family emergency. Just little things, right? But when crunch time came and the company needed people to work late or take on extra projects, guess who volunteered first? The same people who received those small favors. They didn't even realize why they felt so motivated to help out. What makes this so powerful is that it happens without us even thinking about it. When someone helps you, you genuinely want to help them back. You don't realize that maybe their initial help was actually a calculated move to make you feel this way. Cialdini's research showed this works even with favors we didn't ask for or even want. Here's the sneaky way the real pros use this. They start with small, seemingly innocent favors or concessions. Once that feeling of, "I should give back," is triggered in you, they then make bigger requests that you would have definitely said no to if they'd asked right away. But now, you feel this pressure to reciprocate. so you agree to things that aren't even good for you. I once watched this happen in a business negotiation. One side started with an extreme position, then gradually made what seemed like concessions, saying things like, "We're trying to meet you halfway here." But if you looked closely, these weren't fair concessions at all. They were still getting the much better deal. But the other team felt this psychological pressure to give something back, so they made real compromises in return. By the end, they'd agreed to a terrible deal, but they actually felt grateful for the flexibility the other side had shown. Machiavelli told rulers to do exactly this. He suggested appearing to make concessions while not really giving up much at all. He wrote, "The promise given was a necessity of the past. The broken promise is a necessity of the present." He knew the feeling of owing someone is more important than what actually got exchanged. The second big persuasion trick Cialdini discovered is what he calls commitment and consistency. Basically, once we've committed to something, especially publicly, we feel this huge pressure to stick with it. After we take a position or make a choice, we really want to stay consistent with that decision, even if we later realize it wasn't the best idea. Machiavelli was all over this one. He told rulers to get public declarations of loyalty from their subjects. He knew that once someone stands up and says, "I'm loyal to this leader," in front of everyone, they'll feel this inner need to stick with that position, even when the ruler does things they don't actually agree with. Machiavelli said, "The first impression that one gets of a ruler and of his intelligence is from seeing the men he has around him." He was saying that who you publicly associate with shapes how people see you, and it also locks those people into supporting you. I've seen this work like magic in modern companies. I remember one organization that needed to make some big changes that people were resisting. Instead of forcing everyone to change all at once, the smart leaders just asked each department to find one small process they could improve. Nothing major, just one tiny change. But here's the brilliant part. Once people had publicly committed to the idea of improvement, even in this tiny way, they suddenly became much more open to bigger changes. It's like they had to stay consistent with their first step. The trick is to start small and build up. Really skilled persuaders never ask for big commitments right away. They start with tiny little requests that seem harmless. Fill out this quick form, answer a couple questions, attend a short meeting. Each small yes creates this inner pressure to keep saying yes to stay consistent. This is why free trials and samples work so well. They're not just nice offers, they're psychological triggers that use this commitment principle to get you locked in. The third persuasion trigger Cialdini found is something he calls social proof. It's basically our habit of looking around to see what everyone else is doing when we're not sure what to do. When we're in an uncertain situation, we don't usually think for ourselves. We just check what others are doing and copy them. Machiavelli figured this out way before it had a scientific name. He told rulers to make sure lots of people witnessed their good deeds and acts of generosity, but to keep punishments more private. He knew that public displays create patterns that others will follow automatically. He said, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you." In plain English, he meant people form opinions based on what they see happening around them, not by digging deeper themselves. I saw a really smart use of this in a company that was trying to get everyone to use new technology. Instead of forcing people or creating strict rules, they found the informal leaders in each department. Not the managers, but the people others naturally respected and looked up to. They got these people on board first. Once these respected employees were using the new system and talking positively about it, everyone else just naturally followed along. They didn't need to mandate anything. People voluntarily adopted the technology because they saw others they respected using it. This is why testimonials are so effective in advertising, why companies pay celebrities millions to endorse products, and why you see bestseller and most popular choice labels everywhere. We're massively influenced by what we think other people are doing or choosing, often more than by any logical argument about why something is good. The fourth big trigger Cialdini discovered is super simple, but incredibly powerful. We say yes to people we like. We're much more likely to agree with people we find attractive, people similar to us, or people who compliment us. This seems really obvious, but most people don't realize just how much this affects their decisions. Machiavelli totally understood how powerful likability is. He told princes to associate themselves with qualities their subjects admired, even if they didn't actually have those qualities. Everyone remembers his famous quote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." But most people miss the important part, if you cannot be both. Machiavelli wasn't saying fear is better than love. He was saying ideally you want both, but if forced to choose, fear is more reliable. He knew how incredibly powerful being liked really is. I've watched some leaders who are naturals at using this. They always find something in common with whoever they're talking to. They remember personal details about people's lives, and they give genuine compliments. I knew this one executive who kept actual notes about personal interests and family details for everyone in his company. Whenever he talked to someone, he'd always start with a genuine personal connection before getting to business. The loyalty this created was amazing. People would put in extra hours and go above and beyond for him specifically, not just for the company. What's really interesting is all the little things that make us like someone. Good-looking people automatically seem smarter and more trustworthy. That's called the halo effect. Finding any similarity, even something tiny like sharing a hometown or birthday, creates an instant bond. And compliments work even when they're obvious flattery. We still respond positively even if we know someone's buttering us up. People who are good at persuasion use this by quickly establishing things they have in common with you, giving sincere compliments, and connecting themselves to things they know you already like. They do all this before ever asking for anything, because they know once you like them, you're already predisposed to say yes. The fifth persuasion trigger Cialdini discovered is authority, our automatic tendency to follow directions from people who seem to be in charge or have expertise. From when we're little kids, we're taught to listen to teachers, parents, police officers, and doctors. This habit of obeying authority becomes so automatic that we often don't even think about it. Machiavelli was super aware of how powerful perceived authority is. He told rulers to maintain all the visual symbols of power and to connect themselves with established institutions like the church. He knew that looking powerful was often more important than actually being powerful. He wrote, "Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you seem to be, few know what you really are." Basically, he was saying appearances matter more than reality because most people never look beneath the surface. I saw a really clear example of this in a hospital once. When doctors wore their white coats, patients just accepted whatever they recommended without many questions. But when those exact same doctors dressed in regular business clothes, patients suddenly started questioning them and were less likely to follow their advice. Nothing about the doctor's knowledge or expertise had changed at all. Just the visible symbol of authority was missing. What makes this authority trigger so powerful is that it happens without us even thinking about it. We automatically respond to symbols of authority, titles like doctor or professor, uniforms, expensive suits, or fancy offices, without stopping to consider if the person's authority is even relevant to the situation. People who are skilled at persuasion know this, so they make sure symbols of authority are very visible. They also know that borrowed authority works great. Just being associated with experts or established institutions transfers that authority to you. The sixth persuasion trigger Cialdini discovered is scarcity. Our tendency to want things more when they're hard to get or when we might miss out. Opportunities suddenly seem way more valuable when they're limited, and we really hate losing options or freedoms once we have them. Machiavelli naturally understood this concept. He advised rulers to deliver good news in person, but have others deliver bad news, which made their positive attention seem more valuable by making it rare. He also suggested rulers should be somewhat hard to access, not completely unavailable, but not always available either. He knew that scarcity increases perceived value. As he put it, men value the good when they have lost it. We don't appreciate what we have until it's gone or threatened. I've seen this scarcity principle turn ordinary things into hot commodities. One company I worked with couldn't get employees interested in a training program when it was open to everyone. But when they repackaged the exact same program as a special opportunity with limited spots available by application only, suddenly everyone wanted in and they had a waiting list. Nothing about the actual program changed at all, just the perception that it was scarce. This is why you see limited time offer, exclusive opportunity, and while supplies last, everywhere in marketing. They're not just trying to create urgency, they're triggering a deep psychological response that makes us value things more when we think they might not be available later. What's really fascinating about scarcity is how much stronger it gets when you add competition. When we think other people want the same limited thing, our desire for it skyrockets. This explains why auction prices can go crazy high, way beyond what something is actually worth. Watching others compete for a scarce item triggers powerful psychological reactions that override rational thinking. In recent years, Cialdini added a seventh trigger to his original six: unity. This is our tendency to say yes to people we see as part of our group or shared identity. We're much more influenced by people we view as one of us than by outsiders, even when they're saying exactly the same thing. Machiavelli recognized how powerful this group identity is centuries ago. He advised rulers to adopt the customs and traditions of the regions they governed, to appear as part of the people rather than as outsiders. He wanted rulers to blend in and seem like one of us to their subjects. I saw a perfect example of this unity principle when a company was trying to implement some controversial changes. At first, there was tons of resistance, but then they completely reframed the situation. Instead of it being management versus workers, they made it about our company versus our competitors. By creating this shared identity facing a common enemy, they completely transformed resistance into cooperation. Same exact changes, totally different response, just by triggering that sense of, we're all on the same team. This explains why skilled persuaders always emphasize shared connections, common enemies, or collective journeys. When you hear phrases like, "We're all in this together," as a fellow parent, or as someone who shares your values, these aren't just nice ways of speaking. They're deliberately triggering this unity principle to make their message much more persuasive. When someone positions themselves as part of your group, you're automatically more receptive to whatever they're saying. So now that we've gone through all these persuasion triggers, you might be wondering, how do I protect myself when people try to use these against me? The good news is that just knowing about these principles already makes you much less vulnerable to them. When you notice yourself feeling strongly pulled to say yes to something, just pause for a second and ask yourself, which of these triggers is being activated right now? Is someone trying to make me feel obligated by doing me a favor I didn't ask for? Are they making something seem scarce just to pressure me? Are they flashing symbols of authority that don't really matter for this situation? Just being conscious of these techniques doesn't make you completely immune. These triggers are basically hardwired into our brains, but awareness does give you the chance to make an actual choice instead of just responding on autopilot. Beyond just being aware, watch out for these red flags that someone might be using these principles in a manipulative way. When someone creates, what's truly remarkable is how accurately Machiavelli described these principles of persuasion centuries before they were scientifically validated. He didn't have the benefit of controlled experiments or psychological studies, but his careful observation of human behavior revealed the same patterns that modern research has confirmed. This convergence between Renaissance political theory and cutting-edge psychological science tells us something important. Human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed. The same persuasion principles that shaped politics in Machiavelli's time continue to determine who has influence today. The only difference is that now we have scientific terminology to describe what Machiavelli observed through raw experience. So what can we learn from this exploration of Machiavellian persuasion and Cialdini's principles? First, that influence is not random or magical. It follows specific, predictable patterns that can be understood and applied. Second, that awareness of these patterns gives you significant protection against unwanted influence. And third, that ethical application of these principles can help you become more effective in positive leadership roles. Let me share a personal story that illustrates how powerful these principles can be when used together. Years ago, I was consulting for an organization implementing a major technology change that was meeting fierce resistance. The leadership was frustrated, as logical arguments about efficiency and cost savings were falling flat. We completely restructured their approach using Cialdini's principles. First, we identified respected team members, not managers, who were willing to try the new system, social proof. We had executives personally thank these early adopters, reciprocity, and publicly recognize their commitment, consistency. We limited initial access to the system to create a sense that participation was exclusive, scarcity. Leaders shared personal stories about their own challenges adapting to new technology, liking through similarity. We brought in external experts to explain the benefits, authority. And we consistently framed the change as our shared journey toward a better future, unity. The transformation was remarkable. The same people who had been actively resisting the change began volunteering to participate. Within 3 months, adoption had reached 90%, far beyond the initial goal. Most importantly, no one felt manipulated because the new system genuinely benefited everyone. The persuasion principles simply helped overcome the natural human resistance to change. This is the difference between manipulation and ethical persuasion. Ethical persuasion leads people toward choices that benefit them as well as you. It respects their autonomy while helping them overcome the psychological barriers that might prevent them from making beneficial decisions. Machiavelli is often misunderstood as advocating for manipulation and cruelty, but a careful reading of his work reveals a more nuanced view. He recognized that effective leadership requires understanding human psychology and working with it rather than against it. As he wrote, "A wise ruler ought never to keep faith, when by doing so it would be against his interests." This sounds harsh until you recognize that he's simply acknowledging that rigid adherence to rules without considering human psychology leads to ineffective leadership. The most effective leaders, both in Machiavelli's time and today, are those who understand these principles of persuasion and apply them ethically to create positive change. They don't fight against human psychology. They work with it. If you found this exploration of persuasion principles valuable, hit that subscribe button because in the next video, we'll be diving into how Machiavelli's insights intersect with Michel Foucault's concepts of power and knowledge, revealing how information control is the ultimate form of power in the modern world. You'll learn exactly how today's power players use information asymmetry to maintain control, often without others even realizing it's happening. Drop a comment below if you've recognized any of these persuasion principles being used on you, or if you've used them yourself, ethically of course. And remember, this knowledge comes with responsibility. Understanding the science of persuasion gives you power, but true wisdom lies in how you choose to use it. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you recognize persuasion tactics and make more conscious decisions, not to encourage unethical manipulation. How the powerful control reality. Machiavelli and Foucault's dangerous truth. What if I told you that truth isn't what you think it is? That the facts you believe, the news you trust, and even your understanding of history are all shaped by invisible forces of power. This isn't some conspiracy theory, it's the disturbing reality that two of history's most brilliant minds, separated by over 400 years, both discovered independently. Hey everyone, welcome back! If you've been following this series, you know we've been exploring how Machiavelli's insights from the 1500s match perfectly with modern psychology. Today we're taking things deeper by looking at something even more fundamental: who controls what you believe is true and how they use that control to maintain power. In the 1500s, Machiavelli shocked the world by revealing the hidden mechanics of political power. Then in the 1970s, a French philosopher named Michel Foucault took this understanding to a whole new level with his concept of power knowledge. The idea that power and knowledge aren't separate things, but actually create each other. What they both discovered will change how you see everything around you. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and prepare to see the world in a completely different way. Fair warning though, once you understand how truth and power really work together, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing these dynamics everywhere, in your news feed, in your workplace, even in your personal relationships. Let's start with a simple question. What is truth? We usually think of truth as objective facts that exist independently of human opinion. We believe that something is true because it accurately reflects reality, not because someone powerful says it's true. But both Machiavelli and Foucault discovered something surprising. In human society, it doesn't actually work that way. Machiavelli observed that in politics, truth was whatever the ruler said it was. He saw how princes would rewrite history, control information, and shape public narratives to maintain their position. He didn't judge this as good or bad. He simply recognized it as how power actually works. As he famously wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." 4 centuries later, Foucault went even deeper. He showed that power doesn't just control existing knowledge, it actually creates what we consider knowledge in the first place. Power determines which kinds of statements can be taken seriously, which questions can be asked, and which people are qualified to speak on any given topic. In other words, power doesn't just control what we think is true. It shapes what can even be considered as possibly true. I remember when I first understood this concept. I was researching how a major corporate scandal was reported in different countries. The same exact events were described in completely different ways depending on who controlled the media in each country. It wasn't just spin or emphasis. The basic facts themselves changed based on who had the power to define reality. That's when I realized this wasn't just abstract philosophy. It happens around us every day. Think about how many obvious truths throughout history later turned out to be completely wrong. For centuries, the truth was that the Earth was the center of the universe. The truth was that certain races were superior to others. The truth was that women's brains couldn't handle the rigors of voting or higher education. These weren't seen as opinions. They were considered obvious, scientifically proven facts. What Machiavelli and Foucault both recognized is that these truths weren't accepted because they were objectively correct. They were accepted because they served the interests of those in power. The church, scientific authorities, and political leaders all benefited from promoting these particular versions of reality. When power shifted, suddenly new truths became obvious. Machiavelli understood this dynamic centuries before anyone else. He wrote that a wise prince should never lack legitimate excuses to give color to his failure to keep faith. In modern terms, he was saying that powerful people don't just break promises. They redefine the situation so that breaking the promise becomes the right thing to do. They don't just do what's convenient. They change the definition of right and wrong to match whatever they've done. Let's make this concrete with a modern example. Think about how corporations rename job titles to make ordinary roles sound important without actually changing the work or the pay. Sanitation engineer instead of janitor, associate instead of entry-level employee, right-sizing instead of layoffs. This isn't just playing with words, it's using language to reshape how people perceive reality. Or think about how the same military action might be labeled a security operation by one country and an invasion by another. Both sides insist they're simply stating facts, but each is using language that creates a completely different understanding of the same events. Neither is lying in the conventional sense. They're creating different truths through the power of defining the situation. Foucault took this understanding even further by showing how power operates through what he called discourses, systems of thought that determine what can be meaningfully said or understood about a topic. These discourses aren't just ways of talking. They're frameworks that determine what questions we can ask, what evidence counts, and what solutions are possible. For example, think about how mental health has been understood throughout history. At different times, unusual behavior has been defined as demonic possession, moral weakness, disease, or normal human variation. Each of these frameworks wasn't just a different opinion. It created a completely different reality with different experts, treatments, and social responses. The truth about mental illness literally changed depending on which authorities controlled the discourse. I saw a fascinating example of this in a company that was struggling with high turnover. When HR controlled the narrative, the truth was that employees were leaving due to competitor poaching and salary issues. When a new executive brought in outside consultants, suddenly the truth changed completely. Now it was about toxic management and poor work conditions. Same situation, different power structure, completely different facts. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's most important insights about truth and power. He recognized that controlling information is often more effective than physical force. As he wrote, "Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions." He understood that if you can control what people believe, you don't need to control their bodies. Foucault expanded on this by showing how modern power works primarily through knowledge rather than violence. In earlier societies, power was obvious. It was the king's executioner or the slave owner's whip. But in modern society, power often works invisibly through expert knowledge, institutional practices, and the categories we use to understand ourselves and others. Think about all the ways your life is shaped by categories created by authorities. Your credit score, your educational credentials, your medical diagnoses, your legal status. These aren't just neutral descriptions. They're systems of power, knowledge that determine your opportunities, rights, and treatment by various institutions. And most importantly, they seem completely natural and objective, rather than created and maintained by systems of power. This understanding gives us insight into one of Machiavelli's most controversial recommendations. He advised rulers to control information by carefully managing appearances, conducting sensitive business in secret, and using trusted intermediaries to shape public narratives. As he wrote, one should never permit a disorder to persist in order to avoid a war, for war is not avoided thereby, but merely deferred to one's disadvantage. In modern terms, he was saying that controlling the narrative early prevents having to use force later. If you can shape how people understand a situation from the beginning, you won't need to fight their resistance later. This isn't just true for political leaders. It's how smart managers prevent office conflicts, how effective parents establish family norms, and how marketing creates consumer preferences. I've seen this principle at work in countless organizations. When leadership controls the narrative about why changes are happening and what problems need solving, resistance is minimal. When they lose control of that narrative and alternative explanations spread, suddenly the exact same changes face massive opposition. The difference isn't in the actual policies, it's in who controls the definition of the situation. Foucault would take this analysis one step further. He showed that power doesn't just control existing narratives, it determines which narratives can even be considered reasonable. Power establishes the boundaries of the sayable and thinkable. It doesn't just tell you what to think. It structures the entire framework within which thinking happens. Think about political debates that focus exclusively on how to implement a policy rather than whether the policy makes sense in the first place. Or medical discussions that focus entirely on which treatment to use rather than questioning the definition of the condition being treated. These aren't accidents. They reflect how power establishes the boundaries of permissible thought. So how can we apply these insights in today's world of social media and information overload? First, we need to recognize that the battle for control of the narrative has moved online. Machiavelli advised princes to carefully manage public opinion through controlled information channels. Today, governments, corporations, and various interest groups are doing exactly the same thing through digital platforms. Think about how certain topics trend on social media while others never gain visibility. Consider how algorithms determine which news stories you see and which perspectives feel mainstream. Notice how certain sources are labeled authoritative, while others are marginalized as fringe, regardless of their actual accuracy. These aren't neutral technological processes. They're modern manifestations of power knowledge at work. I've been fascinated watching how quickly new, common sense forms online. Ideas that would have seemed radical or unthinkable just 5 years ago now appear as obvious truths to millions of people. Other ideas that were once conventional wisdom have become almost unspeakable. This rapid reshaping of what counts as reasonable discourse shows just how fluid truth really is, and how closely tied to power dynamics. So what are the strategies that modern power players use to control discourse and shape truth? First is categorization, the power to define what something is. Notice how political opponents rush to label events. Is it a riot or a protest? Is it censorship or content moderation? Is it national security or government overreach? Whichever label sticks determines how everyone will understand the situation. Second is credentialing, determining who gets to speak with authority. Watch how certain voices are platformed as experts while others with similar or even superior qualifications are ignored. This isn't random. It reflects who has the power to determine which credentials matter and which expertise counts in any given situation. Third is simple repetition. Both Machiavelli and Foucault understood that truth is partly created through repetition. When the same message comes from multiple seemingly independent sources, it creates the impression of consensus reality rather than constructed narrative. This strategy has become incredibly sophisticated in the digital age, where the same basic talking points can be repackaged through countless different channels. And fourth is perhaps the most powerful: controlling the questions rather than the answers. When you determine which questions are worth asking, you've already shaped most of the conversation. As Foucault might say, power works best when it determines the shape of the playing field, not just who wins the game. I recently witnessed a brilliant example of this in action. A company was facing serious issues with their product, causing customer problems. Rather than addressing whether the product design was fundamentally flawed, leadership redirected all discussion to how customer service could better handle complaints. By controlling the questions being asked, they effectively prevented the real issue from ever being addressed. So where does this leave us? If truth is so tied to power, does that mean nothing is really true? Are we stuck in some kind of hopeless relativism where facts don't matter? Not at all. What Machiavelli and Foucault both understood is that truth exists, but it's always interpreted through frameworks shaped by power. The key insight isn't that truth doesn't matter, it's that truth doesn't speak for itself. Facts don't just emerge naturally into public consciousness. They require platforms, credibility, repetition, and frameworks of understanding, all of which are controlled by systems of power. This doesn't mean giving up on truth. It means becoming more sophisticated about how truth operates in human society. Here's what this means for you personally. First, whenever you encounter a truth presented as obvious or natural, ask yourself, who benefits from this particular understanding? What power arrangements does this version of reality support? Which questions does it encourage, and which does it make difficult to ask? Second, look for spaces where alternative truths can emerge. Both Machiavelli and Foucault recognized that power is never total. There are always cracks in the system, spaces where different understandings can develop. Finding and supporting these spaces is essential for preventing any single power structure from completely controlling reality. Third, recognize your own power in shaping truth. You might not control major institutions, but you participate in creating reality through what you choose to share, how you frame information, and which authorities you recognize. In the digital age, this power is greater than ever before. And so is the responsibility that comes with it. The most important lesson from both Machiavelli and Foucault is that truth and power cannot be separated. We can't access some pure truth untouched by power relations, but we can become more conscious of how power shapes our understanding and more intentional about which power structures we support through our own participation in creating truth. Next time you read a news headline, sit in a meeting where reality is being defined, or participate in an online conversation establishing what's true and false. Remember what these two brilliant thinkers discovered. Truth isn't just reported, it's created. And that creation always happens within systems of power that have their own interests and agendas. If you found this exploration valuable, hit that subscribe button because in the next video, we'll be diving into how Machiavelli's insights intersect with psychological theories of resilience and adversity, revealing how the most powerful people throughout history have turned setbacks into advantages. You'll learn exactly how this mindset can transform your own approach to challenges and failures. Let me know in the comments if you've noticed examples of power-shaping truth in your own life, at work, in politics, or in your personal experiences. And remember, understanding these dynamics isn't about becoming cynical. It's about becoming more conscious of how reality is constructed and more intentional about your own role in that process. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you recognize how knowledge and power interact, not to encourage manipulation or cynicism about truth.